is the 18th in our series of conversations here at the John Nicholas Brown Center. I'm the director, and our goal is, of course, to bring writers and thinkers and architects and artists and musicians together with the publics of Providence to engage in conversation. And Will Morgan is an old friend, and of course one of my favorite critics of architecture. And I love telling the story of how Will and Carolyn came to Providence. So Will is obviously, as you all know, and obviously you're here to hear him, and I'll keep this short, but Will is an architecture historian. He was trained at Dartmouth and Columbia, and then got his PhD in art history at the University of Delaware, and then taught at Princeton for a little bit, and then ended up at the University of Louisville in Kentucky and taught there for 25 years. And then I guess the two of you sat down at some point and said, okay, we need a change of place and pace, and you looked at a map, and you found Providence and thought, that looks interesting, and of course it's a beautiful name, it's Providence, right? I guess you figured out that was your Providence, and you drove up here, and as many of us, me included, you fell in love with the city and settled down here, and been here ever since, which is now something like 20 years, 22 years or something, 22 years, right? And it's a wonderful story, and Will, of course, has been extremely prolific, I should say. So he was professor at the University of Louisville, and University of Kentucky, Louisville, but he also, of course, has taught at Brown a number of years ago, at Wheaton and Roger Williams and Princeton and other places, has edited lots of journals such as Design New England, Art New England, and has written for a long, long list of magazines, which I won't read to you, of course, all of them, and many books. I'm envious how many books you've produced. It's a very long list. I'll just read you the last five or something. There's Snowbound, Dwelling in Winter, A Simpler Way of Life, Monadnock Summer, The Houses of Peter Rose, Yankee Modern, The Houses of Estes and Twombly, The Cape Cod Cottage. Oh, I should mention the Monadnock Summer was actually nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Amazing. And there are many others, American Country Churches, etc. Hiking and Commonen, I think you wrote that when we first met and you introduced me to the Finnish office. But I think many of you, of course, know him in particular for his writing for Go Local, his superbly insightful and critiques of sometimes individual buildings, sometimes broader themes, often adorned with photographs that Will took, and often with remarkable historical images and material. And I'm just picking a few topics. Many of you have read his or get his links every week, of course. Very recently, actually 2 weeks ago, he wrote a rather, shall I say, to the point critique of the Performing Arts Center at Brown. That's being finished as we speak, and he has written of how we can get our mojo back in Providence, how East Providence is the future, which is, how saving Newport by destroying it, the mauling of Thayer Street. But he has also written on affordable housing, on streetscapes, on the best and worst of new construction on the East Side. His writing is always courageous, insightful, often witty and provocative, and so it's really a delight to have you here, Will, and please help me welcome Will Morgan.
I can't live up to that introduction, I'm afraid, but I did notice that these chairs, and you lean back on them, so if you want to go to sleep, they're a little more comfy than your usual ones. When Dietrich asked me to speak at the Brown Center, I assumed it was going to be in something scholarly, something to do with the Brown family, and I suggested talking about John Nicholas Brown, which is always a good topic, and I think he was a great patron of good architecture, especially at Brown University, known for his modern, but he also, I'm sure most of you know St. George's Chapel, which he helped design at the age of 24. So it was a remarkable Gothic Revival building and one of the great treasures of Rhode Island. So another time we'll do John Nicholas Brown as a patron or something. So
Please come back.
well, please come back. Well, Dietrich asked me to speak about my my role as an architecture critic. And when I came here, I did write for the Projo when it was still a newspaper. And I was the architecture critic at Art New England, and I was fired for saying that Brown had the lowest architectural IQ in the Ivies. Since 2016 at Go Local. But since there is no newspaper in this town, it's really essential that we have some architecture and design criticism. I remember, it was early in the 2000s when the Patriots were up for the Super Bowl, and there was a headline, front page of the Providence Journal, was a picture of a man, I had no idea who he was, standing in front of a goalpost, and it was larger than the newspaper would have been for Pearl Harbor, and it said, Bill Can, and Bill Belichick, and I had never heard of Bill Belichick. But that's the kind of thing that happens, whereas games are important in this sports-minded town, but issues of design are really important, and they can have a much longer period of time, so that, anyway, so I thought I would talk, Dietrich asked me to talk a little bit about the state of architectural design in town. Well, these two buildings are only about 5 blocks apart. Or the Fane Tower is just across the river here. You could reach out and spit at it or something. But this is the largest 18th century wooden house that we're in, and it's a fantastic piece of good architecture. And then you have this thing on the right, which a lot of people, when they fuss about the Fane Tower, they say, oh, it's just wrong for Providence. It's not wrong for Providence, it's wrong for anywhere. It might work in Shanghai or in some Chinese city that we don't know the name of but has a lot of people. It doesn't make any economic sense. Aside from an architectural thing, there's no reason for it. It's just plain wrong. So maybe in Sao Paulo or maybe in Shanghai. And what, are there some Fane Tower fans here?
No.
Are you a fan of the Fane Tower?
Friedrich and I wrote a op-ed in favor of an early.
Yeah, I know you did, but everybody has to be wrong now and again. There's really not much you can say about this. As I told Mr. Fane to his face, I said, "You're developing downtown Providence is like having my 15-year-old daughter get ready to go out on her first date, and Jack the Ripper shows up, and I let her go out with him." Absolutely no. Well, it has absolutely no relationship to Providence or anything else. But you'll notice even in the rendering to the left, how sterile it is. And there's a couple of people, out on the bridge about to kill themselves, throw themselves off in despair. But look at this. This is, although the blimp is not real or the dirigible, this is a view of Way-Bossett Street back when. And you'll notice that it's lively. There are people on the street. They're out doing things. There's nightlife. And one of the problems with a skyscraper is a city depends on the street, and a skyscraper really isn't a vertical street. You don't really have great conversations in the elevator. And it separates you. It takes you away from the city, and you need people. Some of the things that have happened in our time here, there's been a real decline in civic architecture. This is, I should say, an hotel, and it doesn't matter. What can you say about a building like this? It could be anywhere. It's cheap. It's appalling. They tore down that not everyone likes brutalism, but they tore down the Fogarty building to put this up here. Is that right? That's the name of it? Anyway, you know the sort of thing that's happening. And the planning for the entire 195 project has been defective from the beginning. Parcel 2 on the left, up in the green area, in my opinion, should be a park. It should not be developed at all. Is there anyone, this was one of the schemes for Parcel 2 by a group that calls themselves Eden. You know, Americans are great about irony. They just manufacture it like crazy. They never know what to do with it. But is there anybody in this room? Of course, this room I'm speaking to the converted, and I know you're fans, that kind of stuff. But is there anybody here who thinks this would add anything to Providence, to College Hill? I mean, it would be fine in Fort Lee, New Jersey, or Miami, but it has absolutely no place here. It's not good architecture. It has nothing appealing to it. And the problem with so many of these kind of developments is they take people away from the street. I mean, so even if you built something here, you could build something better. But people need to be on the street. Who will live in these places? No, it's a serious question. Students come for 4 years, and then they're gone. So we see a lot of these things that are built for students, these kind of student ghettos and cheap student housing that's popping up all over the place, like Vinnie Bonanno's neighbor at 144 Benefit Street, soon to be filled with hundreds of students. No. The winning project for Parcel 2 by Urbanica, a Boston group, okay, some of you can defend it, but do we need this? Does it add anything? Is it something that we really need? The scale is wrong. It's too large. It's in the wrong place. Everything about it is wrong. Not as bad as the Fane Tower, of course. So I like to have a little test, and that is, would you go to Europe to see this building? Well, you know, I mean, we all love to go to Europe. We love to travel. We go see things. And we don't go to look at new crappy hotels, do we? Or shopping centers and so forth. And then there's Benefit Street on the right, which is, I don't have to tell you. It's sad. Modern architects refuse to make meaningful places for citizens or learn from the urban fabric of the city or emulate the architectural characteristics of the region. This project could be anywhere. And even better, on the right from Fountain Street, stop ruining our home. Yeah, it's a cry. Enough. It's not so much modern architects. Modern architects aren't bad. It's the failure to hire decent architects or the failure to understand how a city works and what would make it work better. And what you need is leadership. This is an election year. You hear anybody talking about, you hear them talking about pension reform, you hear them talking sometimes about the homeless, although that's also related to design. But you don't hear people talking about some platforms that would make the city more livable and more enjoyable and more pleasant and give us more trees and fix the sidewalks or fix the potholes, do you? It's perhaps unlikely that you would have a great leader who is also an architect, but when we think of course, Thomas Jefferson, well, still, our physical environment is too important to be left to politicians and lawyers. When you think, for example, about the I-195 Commission, there's not an architect on it. There's not an historian. There's not a planner. I mean, it's like you were to go into a surgical suite and there were no surgeons, and you're about to have something operated on. It's just. How many mayors in the cities hire Shepard Fairey to do their posters? Well, okay. What a city needs is an informed citizenry, an informed public. And it's hard to do that when you don't have a newspaper. And I don't watch television, so I don't know, but I'm guessing that there's not a lot of talk about what the city will look like, or how we could change it, or how we could make it better. Jefferson. Okay. You remember this? A few years ago, when Providence actually thought they had a chance of bringing Amazon here. I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh. It's kind of a combination of Blade Runner meets Brasilia. Well, you remember these schemes? I don't know where this is supposed to be. I think that's maybe Friedrich's Providence Place Mall over there. I don't know. But these buildings with the grass on the top, what's that to do? It's supposed to show that we're environmental or something? You know, okay, would you want to move here? Would you want to live here? I mean, it's so serious. I think it was serious, but it's really sad. It's kind of pathetic. And neither of these really deal with the issue that a city needs, and that's life on the street. So in the 1970s, we had seen the future, and it looked like, Oklahoma City. What is this, 1970, Friedrich? Is that when the city plan was? 57, well, you know. It's with the helicopter, I love it. You know, and these buildings with the folded concrete and so forth. Never mind, people meant well. There's always going to be city plans, but a lot of these things are way too large. Yet, we had this scheme on the right, one of the authors of which is here tonight. Bill Warner always gets the credit, yet it was Friedrichsen Florian and also Irving Haynes who together came up with this idea of opening the river. Really smart. You can relate to this. There are no helicopters, you know? There are boats, there are people, there's water. There are things that you can relate to. When how a city treats its waterfront tells the world how it sees itself. Yeah. It does. All great cities are on water, pretty much. I once gave a lecture and I said that, and a man raised his hand and said, "What about Indianapolis and Atlanta?" So, which proves my point. You know, the thing that really excited us about moving to Providence, almost more than anything else, was when we found out that 195 was going to be moved. They were literally going to pick up the mistakes from back there of the Eisenhower Defense Act, whatever it is, move that highway away and open the city again. Wow, really smart. The bridge itself, we know there were some political issues with that. I won't go into it, but it has been a real success. It's not the best design. It could have been so much better. That's what usually happens in cities, but still, it's bringing people downtown. People want to go down to the water. People want to go to the river, you know? When I was teaching the history of cities, someone would say, well, what makes a great city? And I said, a great city is one where you want to sing a song, write a song about it, or write poetry about it. Okay? It's not about how many hotel spaces it has for conventioneers. Okay? That's not what it's about. As Dietrich mentioned, we moved here. We actually sat down one day. We were living in Kentucky. We were neighbors of Mitch McConnell. And I'm not making that up. And we said, you know, we got to get out. And where would we go? And let's not look for jobs. Let's look for the place where we want to be. And we made a list. And on that list, anyway, we came up with Providence. I mean, we came to visit, and we didn't know. We'd never heard of water fire. And here was this thing like a Viking funeral. You know, it was these things, as before it became too commercial, these fires and the music and this sort of pagan thing of going on. And then to learn that 195 was going to be taken out of the downtown and moved, it was pretty exciting stuff, you know. We came on the weekend that RISD has its fair, you know, instead of a homecoming with football where people selling their art and so forth. It seemed like a really cool place. And there were some good things about Providence. I also knew that Mac Woodward was here, and even David Brusset, although there's someone that I don't agree with very often, if ever, he was writing a column for the newspaper about architecture and urban planning and so forth. So things really seem to be happening in Providence. We thought it was just the cat's meow. Whoops. There's still always the same problems, the preservation problems that you have in any city that's growing. This happened only last year. You remember this? On Wickenden Street, the old, Duck and Bunny? And they promised that it was going to be replaced with something suitably colonial. It hasn't been replaced with anything but an empty lot. But this kind of thing happens all of the time. It's not perfect, but there have been some really exceptional things that have happened since we've been here. Do you all know the box office? Okay, one hand goes up. You haven't all made a tour? Yeah, of course, a lot of you have been to the box office. I mean, this was 3 young people, a recent RISD graduate, working on this thing, coming up with the idea of recycling and creatively using shipping containers. Shipping containers had been used for housing, but they had never, to my knowledge, been used for a commercial building. This was supposed to have been, you all know where this is on Harris Avenue? You can see it, great. You can see it from the train. I mean, it's just, I can't get over how great this is. It was innovative design, and it was also inexpensive. And it was supposed to have been duplicated, and it didn't happen, but I hope maybe it will. How many of you have been here? Wow, this is a pretty good crowd. The Cuisinart Center, oops, sorry, go back. Cuisinart Center at Johnson & Wales. I mean, this was 12 years ago. Was there any, I didn't even know about it. Was there any coverage of this? And Carol and I are driving around as we do, and suddenly there's this building that looks like it ought to be in France or Brazil. This great modern building. Things are happening at the largest university in Rhode Island. It really is amazing. And it's got some good things about it as well, environmentally and so forth, but so handsome. So, excuse me? Louder and funnier, please? What? So you expect design, when you're looking for design leadership, you would expect you would get it from the Rhode Island School of Design. And it's these are personal opinions. You can disagree with everything, but the addition to the Rhode Island School of Design Museum, I think, was a real lost opportunity. There were 4 firms that were invited, and the weakest one won. Not that Raphael Mineo is not a good architect. He's a great architect, but it seems that his European buildings work, but his American buildings kind of fall through. What happened here? So one of the other candidates was Stephen Hole, who designed this art museum in Helsinki. A little more radical, a little more what you would think for the premier art school in the country, you would think. But I have a theory. No one's ever said this is true, but it's in brick. And I think that RISD was afraid of the preservationists. They were afraid of a sad thing that had happened in this town. Historic preservationists got so strong, they'll always nickel and dime you to death on changing windows and doing things and everything, instead of letting the architect do what the architect should do. So, we could have had the best modern firm in Europe, Heikkinen and Komminen. This is their Emergency Services Academy in Kuopio on the left, and on the right, the Embassy of Finland. If you ever go to Washington and you're looking for a great building, of course it's Finnish and it's low key and it's hidden, and you have to know where to look for it. But have you been, Dietrich?
Actually, yes, I have. And they have a sauna in there, which I thought was so amazing.
Right, I know.
For everyone who works in the embassy, they all know.
Well, at the dedication, one of the architects said sauna, and so we fired it up, and people upstairs are in black tie, and we're sitting naked downstairs, with the birch twigs and so forth. But it's just magnificent. A great firm. RISD has done some really great things. Nader Turani, who's a graduate of RISD, Did the library downtown, you know, in the old. What a great idea. Recycled. And then they turn around and do the student center, which has got to be one of the most embarrassingly awful buildings that's been put up in a while. Never mind. But since then, have almost redeemed themselves. Nader Turani designed this dormitory at RISD, which is made out of laminated timber. I think it's at the time, it was the largest timber building in New England. Is that right? And it was brought here on a truck from Canada. It was designed, the module can fit on a tractor trailer. And so it was innovative, it was inexpensive, it was pioneering, and, you know, maybe you don't think it's handsome. I happen to think it's incredibly handsome, but it doesn't matter. There it is, and the wall on Waterman Street with this. It's just the variations of the brick. It doesn't have to be shiny, fancy material. It's just a really solid building. So let's talk a little bit about Brown. I'll never be invited back, I know. But then Vinny's here, so it's. Yeah, no, I know. So I hope some of you know where this is. Yeah, a lot of people nodding. This is in 1970, Progressive Architecture always had a building, a design of the year. And in 1970, it was the new Pembroke Quad. It beat out 669 other buildings. Robert Venturi was one of the jurors, I forget some of the other ones. It was designed by Donlan Linden and Charles Moore, MLTW, who did Sea Ranch. And then, 25 years later, it got the American Institute of Architects 25-year design award. You know? How many of you have been inside, been in this quadrangle? Great, that's fabulous. A bunch of you. But and Brown doesn't take very good care of it. It really needs a lot of maintenance. But here's this building on the cover, and never mind. I'm a great believer in architectural competitions. Brown finally had one. And there were 3 solid finalists, including Shop, who have become a really important firm since then. This is for the Nelson Fitness Center. There's 2 designs at the top from Shop. And also Charles Rose in Boston and Lears Weinzappel Associates. And most of you know this story? Yeah. Jonathan Nelson gave the money. Richest man in Rhode Island, is a Brown trustee. Jonathan Nelson said, "Oh, I don't like modern architecture. I wanted Bob Stern from Yale, who was once a great architect." So they tore down that building, which was Felix Candela or someone, a modern Mexican masterpiece, and they put up this building that has all the gravitas of Saran wrap. It looks a lot like an old AMP. Do you remember those things at that time? And I don't know whether it's adding insult to injury, but then they tore down the Marble Gymnasium, which was a fitness center that was built like a brick, you know what, and from the 1920s, Wallace Howe, great building. They tore it down, and then they took this thing off. Never mind. Carolyn said when they tore down the Marble Gymnasium and they left this cupola sitting in the field for several years, she said, it's like a woman going in for a mastectomy and they save the breast, but lose the patient. So, and then, I mean, I can't answer all of these questions, but there's somebody tell me that this building works well. This building, you get much feedback on this building? Does it work really well? This is the Granoff Center. And it is cut in half, and it was sliced so that students can look from one studio into another student and find out what other people are doing, and all this transference of ideas and all this sort of architectural BS that these people spin out. I think the reason that this building was built, again, a personal opinion, was it was to show that Brown can hire a trendy avant-garde firm. So what you end up with is a trendy avant-garde building. On the other hand, this building, which gets hardly any notice at all, as bad as the Granoff is, this building is quite the opposite. This is the new labs building at Brown, engineering labs, by Kieran Timberlake. You may remember that Kieran Timberlake designed and built the American Embassy in London, which Trump refused to dedicate when he was there at the opening. But this building is a serious building. We know Kieran Timberlake are really important in terms of environmental design, but it has a presence, it has a probity, it has a classical thing about it. Dietrich, I think this has a kind of Schinkel-esque aspect to it. Yeah, I know, but it's stretching it a little bit, but it's very handsome, it's elegant, it's functional. I think it's a real addition to the Brown campus. And further down the street seems to be Brook Street has become the kind of architectural marketplace along, all of these things, good and bad, happening. Toshiko Mori, another, I have this theory that Brown hires great architects, and then they never know what to do with them. This addition of the Watson Center is very attractive on the outside. It's very awkward on the inside. It has some problems joining up with the buildings that it's attached to. But I think it's, overall, it's she's a great modern architect, and I think that it really is really well done. And it sort of breaks from the tradition. The Watson building is another building where they hired Raphael Vignoli, one of the great architects, and it wasn't supposed to be built out of brick, but there's all this fear that somehow the ghost of Antoinette Downing or the NIMBY people are going to come along, and so it was changed, and it was lessened in a way. But I think this is a handsome addition. Brown, as we know, is a neighborhood bully. It could not be any other way, given its constricted neighborhood. Yet, College Hill is the reason that Brown is so successful. Okay? People want to come to Brown because they come and look at it, and they see this astoundingly beautiful campus, and they don't say, "Mom, I'd really rather go to a state university where they have Quonset huts left over from the last war." It's part of Brown's DNA. It's part of its its identity, and yet they're always messing with it. You remember these buildings on Brook Street? There were 7 of these houses, turn of the 20th century, which Brown said were in such bad shape they had to come down. Well, they were owned by Brown. Brown was the ones that let them go bad. Okay. And then further down Brook Street, maybe these are not the greatest houses in the world, but there's a sense of scale. There's a sense of the street. There's a sense of people. It's not so much the sense of a fortress. And this is where those 7 houses stood. This is the new health center by William Rawn, who is a good architect for other colleges. He's done some really good dorms for colleges, like Amherst and Williams, places like that. But when it comes to Brown, it's a sheep in sheep's clothing. It's just, this is corporate. Does anyone say, boy, I was going to go to Yale, and I was going to live in Brantford Quadrangle, and then I saw this at Brown, and I knew I wanted to live here, Motel 6. And my favorite detail up there on the left is the kind of, I presume it's a security camera. It's to protect you, I suppose, from being mugged because you're on a street where there are no people, because they're all in a building that's only, you get into by 1 or 2 entrances. So here's the question. Would you go to Europe to see this building? Of course you would, I can see. Deborah Burke is another really good architect at other places. She's the dean at Yale. She can do strong, innovative work. But here, these new dorms, you're all familiar with these on Brook Street. They're already turning, it's interesting how they've spun it, that they're turning a couple of parking lots into a park. They're not tearing down, The architect said of this building, it will reinforce the community. Do you feel reinforced? It's accessible and inviting. Architects, they should never write about their work. They should never do those things at the beginning of their websites, where they talk about what they think about. He said it has a strong relationship to its context. It will transform 2 gravel parking lots into a new publicly accessible green space, blah, blah, blah. Of course, and it sometimes happens with Brown as they get kind of second courses from someplace else. This is Deborah Burke's dormitories at Princeton, which I think you need a little similar, to say the least. And I think they're quite handsome. So what you have is, Brown, it's the lesser of the Ivies. Let's give it the knockoff. Princeton will get the good one, and Brown will get, I don't know that that's true, but you kind of wonder about that. But the other thing is that these Princeton buildings are not in the center of town. They're not on Nassau Street. They're off in a field somewhere. They didn't tear down buildings to put them up. And then, of course, we already know about this one. But this is the height of arrogance. I mean, maybe Brown needs a performing arts center, but what happened was Brown just got totally bedazzled by the money. Everybody knows now that it was supposed to be Ron Perlman who was giving the money here. His name has been taken off, and Brown is scuttling for another donor. But it was Ron Perlman who said, I want the building right here. Is it the best place in terms of parking, in terms of crowds? And anyway, perhaps I've said enough about this building, but Ron Perlman also gave a college at Princeton, of which his name has been removed because he hasn't been making the payments. It's like the Music Man comes into town, and the Brown Board of Trustees dances around them and says, great, we're going to have this famous building. Oh, never mind. And we've seen some other things. Thayer Street has been continually changing, sometimes better, and it seems to be kind of at the edge of ruination, but I think people have been saying that about Thayer Street for decades. Yet bookstores and restaurants are being closed for banks. You have a corner with 2 banks on it. Banking, anyway. I'm serious. I mean, what do you need banks for? You use your ATM card, but you don't need a whole building. And this whole idea of building, everybody needs, because of the pressure of Brown and all the students here, we want the students, but people are building apartment houses like crazy. And you have this is one of my favorite architectural details in all of Providence. A brick wants to do what? Anyway, and there were, when you see a building like that on Thayer Street, it invariably replaces a building that was 2 or 3 stories high and was shingled. There was something that you could relate to. But where some things have really been good happening in Providence is the street. I mean, we know Atwell's Avenue has changed. It is in trouble. It's becoming less Italian. But Hope Street is the paradigm of what an urban experience should be. And one of the things that changed Hope Street was 7 stars. I mean, in 20 years, it literally changed the neighborhood. You ask real estate people, it changed that part of town. It really has, one great business can have an effect on the neighborhood. One of the things that COVID has shown us is that how much we really need each other. And we need not to be in high rises, we need to be on the street. So there have been a lot of good developments, and I'm reaching the end of my time here, but there was the competition, I don't know what's going to happen with it, to repurpose the Bascule Bridge. And I just wish there'd been some more fun designs. Ski Providence, yeah. Okay. But the amazing thing about Providence is that while we think about building new things, there's such a trove of phenomenal architecture here. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. Really good stuff. We need to figure out how to save the Cranston Street Armory. And apparently we're on the way to saving the Superman building. So we'll stop there. I think it's been half an hour. It's a great place. Take care of it. Okay, thanks. Is it okay? What?
Take a few questions?
Sure. Yes.
Excuse me. With respect, I wish you had addressed the question, how? How did this come about? You didn't mention the Preservation Society, you did mention Brissett. I've lived here for 50 years. I'm not an architect. I love architecture. I've been in every building you showed us except the one at Princeton. I took 3 classes with Deep Peter when I was teaching my own classes over at Warwick. Much of which, there's nothing to take exception. I found nothing to take exception with what you said. You might have mentioned that Brown's failure to maintain the new Pembroke quad is only one example of its failure to maintain, period. It puts up and then neglects. The Warwick Music Building, not a great building, which I lived in for 30 years while I taught, and I know all of its problems, is miserably maintained. There's not even ventilation in the bathrooms. The trash outside is constant. I planted, my last act as chairman of the Youth Department was to plant 4 flowering cherry trees in front of the, well, one corner of them. All of them were allowed to die. No exception, but what you're describing, the travesties you're describing, and the lack of vision, it didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of somewhere, and I wish you had addressed that larger question. I think Mr. Brissett has been a catastrophe for this city in that you're absolutely right. First-rate architects, we bring them here and they do second-rate work. I think part of it is that they are mown down. They're just mown down by preservationitis. Had there been a PPS in the 18th century, this city would all be wigwams. And we reward very little. There's, as you pointed out, some wonderful contemporary architecture here, but it's not because of, it's in spite of, I think. And you look at Yale, they're not afraid. They build superb fake 18th century and superb cutting edge 21st century. Or Exeter, magnificent. Or at the same time as they're committed to preserving scale and the past.
Right.
But they're not afraid of the present and the future. This city is petrified of the future. And it has fetishized historicism so, 50 years worth of watching this, so overwhelmingly that it makes it almost impossible. When I came here, when you write about this horrible Rex building, when I came, 10 years after I arrived here, Howard Swearer became president, our beloved Howard Swearer. He wanted to put a building paid for by the Olin Foundation on what is now called the Ruth Simmons Quadrangle.
Lincoln Green.
Excuse me?
Lincoln Green. Lincoln
The
Green.
former Lincoln Green. It is now the Ruth Simmons something or other. And he was determined. We needed a science center. Olin said, we'll pay for it. Olin was putting up buildings at every university, but they, like Perlman, they wanted it to be right in the middle of everything. And they planted it on the former Lincoln Green. We organized, one colleague of mine and I organized a city. And we got our students to work. We sat on Lincoln Green for 3 weeks, going home only at night, having our food brought to us by students, until finally Howard got the message and had to say no to Olin. It broke his heart because Olin refused to build another building here. They couldn't have their spot. But we did it. Nothing ever happened like that with the monstrosity that Rex is putting up, or that horrendous Granoff Center. And there's been no, the blood's been pulled out of us, and part of it is that we're not allowed because of the historicism.
Well, I think one of the things about preservation, and I started out in have a degree in preservation, is that they got so strong in Providence that you get this kind of thing where with that Deborah Burke building, those things on dorms on Brook Street, you have all these endless meetings and it end up changing the shape of the windows when you're asking the wrong question. It's way too late to do that.
So I wish you would address it. Perhaps you'll do it for local prop. The issue of not what's good and what's bad, but how does the culture of this city, or how do the various cultures of the city make impose their will on the architecture of the city, and the planning of the city?
Bob?
Yo, what's your favorite building in Providence? Old or new?
This question.
Wow. Oh, that's a tough one. I always like buildings that are unappreciated.
Dunkin' Donuts Center, maybe?
No, the Dunkin' Donuts Center. Close to that is the Paul Rudolph apartment block for the Benevolent House, which wasn't completed as it should have been, but that's a wonderful building. I'm not gonna, that's just too hard. There's so many really great ones, and there's so much here. I don't know how to answer your question. I'm not that kind of a historian. Greed.
No, everybody's greedy.
Well, everybody's greedy. But one of the things that's so sad about what you're talking about is people want to come to Providence and they want to build buildings, and then you get these meetings where the trades unions comes in and they say, oh, we need jobs and all this kind of thing. But in fact, you want to make it profitable for builders and developers to build here. But to build a good building doesn't cost any more, and sometimes it costs less than a bad building. I don't know, does it go back to education? Does it go back? I don't know. I wish, you know.
There's a culture here that, look at the culture in LA and then look at the culture here. Look at the culture in Boston. It's a terrible culture for new architecture in Boston. LA is a great culture for architecture.
Yeah.
It's the heavy hand of the past. I think that we don't discriminate between what to say.
Other thing, but it would be nice to have some leaders that knew some things, that cared about some things. I don't hear anybody talking. Do you hear any of the candidates saying what we need to do is, and some of these issues like the homeless are design problems. They can be design problems. You know, you have a question, someone?
Question, comment. Not an architect, just an appreciator of things that I perceive to be beautiful. But years ago, I ran across a book called A Pattern Language. It's my favorite book in the whole world. It's my go-to book for comfort in whatever.
Right.
And it just seems to me that maybe this should be required reading, not only for architectural students, but also city planners and for all these other people. I think it is a matter of education.
Right.
Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know.
No, Christopher Alexander's book is like a Bible, but you say people that should read the book. The city planner in Providence is someone with a master's degree in community planning. I don't even know what that is. It's probably some kind of sociological stuff. Why don't we hire some people that, you know, I don't know.
I could read it to them as a bedtime story.
You can read it to them as a bedtime story. Or that some of these things are really quite simple to find the solutions to, but everyone is, I don't know. I'm not a politician. I'm not even an architect. So, you know, another question? I can't. Yeah.
You talked about what a great idea it was for someone to uncover the river.
Yeah.
Which makes you wonder, what was the rationale to cover it up in the first place?
Greed? I don't know. They just, what was it? Why did they cover the river? Because
Trains.
trains?
It was the odor that came from that polluted river.
Right.
It was horrendous.
Yeah, right.
So they just cover it up. You don't solve the problem.
It was downstream of Oliveville's
Yeah.
factories,
Yeah.
and it took all of the effluent off of Smith Pelle's sewage.
So where there's muck, there's money. You know, right? Is it? You know. Yeah, Friedrich.
Yeah, well, no, I enjoyed your lecture very much, but there was one thing that we should not forget, and that is that Providence, in the last 25 years, 30 years, has done something that probably no other city that I know of in the world would have done. They relocated the railroads, and they relocated the rivers, and then finally Bill Warner insisted on relocating I-195, and this was an amazing success. The city really changed its footprint. You know, when former students of mine come back to Providence after 30 years, they can't believe it. What happened to Providence? You know, I take them to Wildfire, and you mentioned, you know, the city, and I quote you, the city is nothing without the streets and, you know, the street life, and when you criticized the singular tower. And that's true, and I mean, Wildfire is electrifying. You know, when I go to Europe, people know about it. They have heard about it. You know, when I used to say when they asked me where do you live, I said I live between New York and Boston because I was afraid they wouldn't have never heard of Providence. Now I proudly say I live in Providence, and you know what? They say, oh, Providence. No, that is wonderful. And they want to hear about this, you know, but there is, unfortunately, that's why I love your title so much. There's a sad ending, you know. What is happening right now with the relocation of 195 is a disaster. Is a disaster. But with the exception of the bridge, right? You know, with the exception, the bridge is a beautiful piece, and you know, as you probably, I mean, a footnote. I ended the competition.
Yes, in years one.
We won actually, but Cicilline didn't give us a shot. Okay, but at least another story. But anyway, the bridge is successful because there was it was the right way of doing it, you know. And I remember also at the beginning when the demolition of 195 was completed, Dietrich and I were interviewed, and you know, and we said, I can't remember the headline now. Starting from scratch, then, right? Starting from scratch, and there was a moment of euphoria and triumph in the city. We're going to do something, and Dietrich and I decided at that moment to give a joint studio for Brown students in urban studies and architecture students at RISD. But of course, the students went too far. They just could not hold back, you know. They came back with the model of the Ringstrasse in Vienna and the Champs-Élysées in Paris, right? And that was so out of scale. But I do think that Providence has its own icons, right? The arcade and our State House and the Industrial National Bank building are truly unique and measure up to any other quality. So we have the record, and that's what you said anyway, and we have it on the Brown campus. But now now that we are actually at the point where we are building buildings on these parcels that become available, that's where the real disaster is.
Right, it's a disaster. But, and some of you are aware of this thanks to people like Sharon Steele and Daisy, and that the 195 Commission has added 3 professional advisors to their advisory committee. It was just one architect from Boston, and they've added some extra advisors. And I think people are fed up, and so fed up with what happened with Parcel 2, that I don't think they're going to get away with just doing another building like they've been doing. It's late, I know, but that's one of the ironies. They call it the innovation district, and then you make it look like Motel 6 or Oklahoma City or
And
something.
why should we settle for that?
Why should we? Exactly.
Why should we
settle for less?
There's
Why
the
can
cultural
we not
cost.
demand
Back at culture.
that we start from scratch
Right.
right now?
Why should we?
One last question.
I enjoyed so much your remarks and your irony and the whole very interesting talk. And a lot of good. Professor of music, I don't know your name.
David Josephson.
We were together in the parking lot a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, I don't agree that historicism has done what has happened to Providence. In fact, the Providence Preservation is a totally impotent organization which has no real legal basis to stop buildings. It almost can stop nothing. It almost never does. When the monstrosity of the Performing Arts Center was being designed, Brown wanted to knock down most of the rest of the block, and it really was stopped not by the Preservation Society, which I'm a member and a donor, but it was stopped by a Brown student who happened to be the granddaughter of an important alumnus who was here, who started an action to keep the environmental center up, and otherwise Brown would mow it down. What is going on in Brown today is that the trustees, the board of the corporation of Brown is made up almost all of out-of-town people, faraway people. There are 3 Rhode Island natives on the entire corporation. So everything is very much done by the administration. It's a very calculated way to do it. Is to, if you want to take away, we used to have advisory committees for architecture, facilities design committee with some really distinguished people that came from around the country that we really don't have the mass of Providence. We don't have a Carter Brown. We don't have an Agnes Gunn. We don't have the people that were serving on facilities and design in those years.
Right.
And they're not there today. And so now the Brown Planning Department can say yes to a wellness center that looks like an insurance building and say yes to it because there isn't the critical mass of cultivation, frankly, of people who can stand up and do what Will's talking about right now. But I do have to agree with Friedrich very much that the transformation of Providence should not be looked at. Should not be brushed off as nothing. It really was a miraculous event. You know, when I grew up in Providence, they said you could develop film in the Providence River. It was so polluted with plating chemicals. So a lot has happened. It's very good about our city. But it's not, and you know, I'm a preservationist, but I don't belong to the necrophiliac division of the preservation. That nothing can ever go down. I think some buildings should go down, but Brown has knocked down 30 of them in the last 25 years. And so I don't think historicism is our problem, Doctor. But I think poor design is, and some of the concepts that Will has come up with about what happens to architects when they come here, how it's read. We're terrible clients. I'm Brown, because I'm a 50-year Brown guy, you know. But anyway, end of speech.
So maybe this is a good moment. Thank you, Vinny. A good moment before I thank our speaker. I wanted to invite you all to the music room to continue the conversation over wine and food and seltzer water.
Sorry, I delayed that.
No. It was very well, very nice final words. But I'd just like to say this was just as much fun and as courageous and provocative as I had expected. So thank you very much.